Welcome to the Week 1 tutorial on Overview of Research. In this tutorial, I will be going through the three kinds of research that we will be looking at in this course. What I also invite you to do in preparation for session 1 of the class is to look in Canvas and look in the Files section. In the Files section, you'll see a folder entitled Materials for Week 1. And if you open that, you will see three articles that will actually be useful in looking at as I go through these slides, as they are concrete examples of what's being talked about in this tutorial. So when I talk about the large group research, the article that is an example for that it'll be the Adolescent Mothers article, Helping Adolescent Mothers, and you'll find that in Canvas again. When we talk about single case research, there is an article that is using a personal digital assistant and helping a student with Asperger's syndrome. And then when I talk about qualitative research, there is an investigation that is entitled They Just Don't Understand Parents' Perspectives on Challenging Behavior. That is also listed in Canvas. I tried to, when I listed the articles and named them, they will have quantitative example, single case example, qualitative example. So you should be able to find them fairly quickly. But get those, print those, and look at those. What we're going to be doing in class, just so you know, the purpose for your going through this tutorial now is to get all of this acquisition material. I encourage you to print the articles that I just talked to you about and mark on those articles where you're seeing some of these points that I'm talking about in this tutorial, because in class we're actually going to go through where you find these points and these different design features in the articles, and we'll discuss this as a group. The more you prepare, the faster we'll go. The sooner you'll get out and be able to trick or treat. So that's all I'm saying there. All right. So the first type of research that we're going to be looking at in this class is quantitative or group research. Another label that this type of research is called is, sometimes it's referred to as large N research. N means number, specifically number of participants. This research typically involves comparisons between two or more groups of participants receiving different interventions. So there are actually three sort of subsets of large group research. So the first type you'll see in the slide, so if you have two or more groups of participants that are receiving different interventions, that is experimental research typically. I have a handout that's going to explain this that I'll give you in class. There's also research involving large groups of people who have different characteristics. That's quasi-experimental, meaning that the difference really between experimental and quasi-experimental research has to do in how you sample the population. If you can get a random sample of a population and then do some really fancy stuff with it, that's usually experimental research. If you have pragmatic considerations that prevent you from doing a random sample, perhaps you have a certain population, you work at a school and these are your kids and this is who we're working with and I'm going to use them, that's fine. Because you don't get a random sample, it's quasi-experimental. Lots of educational research is quasi-experimental just because of the applied nature of it. Or the last type is research that examines the perspectives of a population. So it's what do parents of kids with disabilities think of X? So that's non-experimental research. Yes, we're sampling a large population. We're asking them questions. We're trying to see maybe if there's relationships between different demographic features of some of our participants and how they responded. So parents with more than 2 children responded this way, and parents with less than 2 children responded this way. But we're not really doing any kind of intervention with them. We're just trying to examine their perspectives and see if there's any correlations or relationships between some different factors of the population and how they're responding. The purpose of research, if you're looking at large group research, again, is to formulate hypotheses or draw conclusions that can be transferred to the larger population. The easiest way to explain this really is to step outside of educational research and think about some of the things you might watch on the news at night that have to do with sort of medical research. So I'm sure you all have watched the news or CNN, and you'll hear a story about there's been research done and they've compared these two groups, and one group received a lot of oat bran. They ate a lot of oat bran in their diet, and the other group didn't. And the ones who ate a lot of oat bran, they had a reduced risk of cancer. And therefore, and here's where this slide comes in, and therefore, everybody or these types of people or these people in the larger population should probably eat more oat bran, right? We're trying to draw conclusions that can be transferred to the larger population. Taking it to education, this reading program worked with all of these kinds of students, and therefore everybody should use it, or this type of student should use it. Okay, so we're trying to sort of make these extrapolations to a bigger population when we're doing large group research. The types of research questions that are posed are things like this. How does X affect Y? Okay, how does your age affect how much you retain reading content, how much you retain reading content in science. That was really, I'm pulling that out of the air. How does the number of children a parent has affect his or her perspectives about homework? Another type of question that can be posed is which intervention, X or Y, is more effective? Which one? Phonics reading program or whole language reading program? Which one is more effective? Another type of question is what does this population of people think about X? What do parents of elementary age students think about foreign language instruction at the elementary level? Okay, so these are the kinds of questions that can be asked. Again, I'm hoping that you have the large group article that you should have is the adolescent mother article. So one thing that you might be doing is looking at that article and seeing if you can find what their research questions are and what type they fall into. Major issues of importance that large group or large quantitative research cares about are, again, drawing generalizations to the larger population. To do this, participant sampling matters, that idea of random sampling. As we get into the course, we'll talk about different ways to sample a population. Random sampling sort of the gold standard, although there's other ways to do this. Lots of times there's a control group that's used for the purposes of comparison. If you have a control group, that group doesn't receive any treatment at all, and then you might have these other experimental groups that would receive treatment A. Maybe one group will receive treatment A, another group receive treatment B, treatment C, and whatnot. When you're looking at quantitative research, large group research, if you're looking at an article that is written that has used that kind of methodology, the research process is very structured. It's determined ahead of time. You can see this if you're looking at the article. It will outline the procedures very specifically, the participant sampling, data collection, how they're defining different things, protocols that they're using. It's all up front. They decide that before they do anything with a participant. So researchers have that laid out and mapped out before any data are collected. Most of the time data are collected in numeric form, and analysis involves statistical formulas. So they're going to be cranking a lot of math. They're going to be talking about the specific statistics that they've used. We will talk about statistics a little bit. This is not a stats course, so you're not going to become an expert by any means, but hopefully you'll get enough to begin to understand what folks are doing when you're reading these articles. The person of the researcher is really removed from the investigative context. So there's this idea of the researcher as a scientist who is unbiased, doesn't want to influence the investigative context, really wants to remove him or herself from it, doesn't want to contaminate it. So you're not going to really see the person of the researcher or read about who the researcher is too much. There might be a little paragraph at the end of the article saying so and so works at this university, and that's about all. But you're not going to really see the researcher engage him or herself in the investigative context too much. That's pretty typical. People usually expect that, but as we get into qualitative research, you'll see that that's not necessarily. There are other options that researchers have in terms of their presence in the research process. Okay, so I encourage you to either stop now or at some point to just make sure that you, in light of the slides I just went through with quantitative research, that again you look at the adolescent mother article and you're sort of looking at, okay, do I see that those procedures are pretty, outlined carefully and in lockstep? Do I see what the research questions are? Do I see kind of what the overall purpose of the research is? Do I see how maybe they sampled do they say how they sampled their population of participants? Okay, so you should be using that article to get kind of a lay of the land as to how this kind of research works. Okay, so now we're going to move to the second kind of research that we're going to look at in this class, and it's single subject design. It again is quantitative research. Quantitative meaning data are collected in terms of numbers usually, but it's single subject design. So the number of participants is pretty small as compared to those large group quantitative studies. Single subject design is synonymous. Sometimes you'll see something called single case design. Same thing. They mean the same thing. It's research, though, that involves one or a small number of participants whose performance is compared to himself or herself or themselves over time. Sometimes it's called a time series design. The article actually that is an example that I posted for you is the using a personal digital assistant to help a kiddo with Asperger's syndrome. So if you want to have that article up and looking at that, that's the one that is the example article. The purpose of research is really to affect change on behaviors of social importance. So large group research also cares about that, but it can be very more, we call it basic research. So it's trying to find things that may or may not have really hardcore pragmatic implications for what we do in classrooms. Single case design or single subject design is absolutely interested in having a pragmatic impact. So behaviors of social change are social importance. Things like Johnny's banging his head. What can we do to stop him? Susie can't read. Well, what can we do to help her? Johnny does not know how to appropriately ask to play with peers. What can we do? A lot of intervention research in special ed uses single subject design. So while it is kind of a subset of quantitative research, we're really going to look at it closely because there's so much special ed research that uses this kind of research paradigm. Types of research questions posed. Does this intervention affect this behavior? What does X do to Y? That's pretty much, so if we introduce a relaxation routine and a visual schedule, how does that affect the number of incidences that Johnny bangs his head on the wall? Major issues of importance in single subject design is, again, focusing on changing behavior that is observable and measurable. So the number of times somebody bangs their head, the number of words somebody can read per minute, the number of times a child appropriately asks another person to play, all of those kinds of things. The emphasis is on investigating issues or problems that are socially valid and results that have social significance. And those terms really have specific definitions when we look at single case design. And we'll get into that more as we get further into the course. But just as a brief example, somebody who is doing a single case or single subject research, let's pretend like I'm trying to do an intervention to help Johnny stop banging his head on the wall. Maybe I do collect some baseline data and I find out that on average Johnny beats his head against the wall 50 times a day. And I come up with a really great intervention I think that I'm going to do. And I implement this with Johnny. And when I do that systematically, I find that I can reduce his head banging behavior. I go from 50 times a day down to 10 times a day. Now, while that, if I put that through some statistical formulas, that's statistically significant, meaning mathematically, that's showing that there's a big change in behavior, right? But a single case researcher would say that the social significance of those results are questionable because still, to bang your head against the wall 10 times per day is still too much. And so, while you did get some results that showed a pretty big drop, the social significance of those are questionable because really we need it down, that behavior down to 0. Like the large group research, well, this is slightly different. Research in single case design is most of the time done in applied settings. Large group research may or may not be, but single case design, again, because it is interested in such pragmatic questions, the research is usually done in classrooms, in community settings, in homes. It's where people actually live and do their business. So it's usually done in applied settings. Like quantitative research, the large group research, the research process is structured. It's determined ahead of time. So all those procedures, definitions, data collection, data analysis, all that is determined before anything is begun with a participant. And like large group research, researcher influence is removed from the investigative context. The position of the researcher is that that person is unbiased, doesn't want to contaminate the research context, and is removed from the research context. So again, the personal assistant article is what you should be looking at, and kind of trying to see if you can look at that article and see where the points in this PowerPoint kind of map out onto that article. In single subject design, design is the key to showing intervention effects. And so with large group design, we really rely on the use of statistics to show intervention effects. Design is the key to showing intervention effects. So there's certain ways that we order or think about the conditions of a research study to compare a participant to him or herself over time. Data are usually collected and presented in numeric form, and you can usually tell a single subject design by this visual inspection. There's usually a line graph that is used in the presentation of results, and you should be able to look at the line graph and get a pretty good idea of the results and the effects that the intervention is having on the student's behavior. Interventions often rely on ABA principles. If you've had me in class before, you will know that ABA is not sitting at a table with a one-on-one therapist and doing mass trial training over and over again while I give you M&Ms. There are some ABA principles that are being used there, but that is like a tiny subsection of applied behavior analysis. Applied behavior analysis really is a whole technology in terms of techniques and tools involving schedules of reinforcement, schedules of punishment, environmental arrangements, and ways of prompting students to do things. And so if you are unclear about that, we can certainly have that discussion in class, but it is bigger than what we tend to think about when we think about ABA therapy that students get. So If you have questions about that, make a mental note to ask me in class. Okay, so now we're going to move to qualitative research. That is the one that is the you don't understand parents' perspectives on challenging behavior. So qualitative research focuses on a particular case. Case can be a person, a process, an event, a group, an organization, but really it uses data in the form of words to draw conclusions. So it's using people's responses to interview questions. It's using focus group responses. It is doing artifact analysis. It is doing, observations in the field and collecting field notes and doing analysis with those. So it's looking at words instead of numbers. The purpose of research is really to understand the meaning of human action. So what does it mean? What is it like to be the parent of a child with autism? What is it like to be a student who has a learning disability and is included in an elementary setting? What's it like? How do people do things? What is the significance of factor X to this person? Okay, so much more open-ended questions that qualitative research likes to wrestle with. And here they are. Types of research questions that are posed. Things like why, how, what's the value of this? What is this like? So much more open-ended than the quantitative research that we've just looked at. Major issues of importance. Data collection primarily relies on words. There's this idea of thick description, which is an anthropological term we'll talk about. But it's really, we need to see sort of the description of the context and the settings, way beyond, what a little demographic chart that might be put into a study. It's a pretty big description of the participants, the setting, the context, so that you can get an idea of, really what's happening, so that those data that, are being shared in the results, you can really see from where those data come. Other issues of importance. Research should really work to understand phenomena from the participant's point of view. Really want to walk in the footsteps of the participants. The research process, unlike our quantitative friends, is much more open-ended and iterative in nature, because the nature of text, usually, of words, is that you're not really sure what kind of results you're going to get. And therefore, especially when we're talking about analyzing data, sometimes you can have a game plan for how you're going to do that, but lots of times it's really thinking, having the data talk to you and think about what would be the best way to analyze things. When we get into qualitative research, you'll see the person of the researcher and what he or she brings to the research process matters. And we'll look at two sort of schools of thought about this issue. There are some qualitative researchers who would say the person of the researcher matters, and the researcher needs to be aware of what he or she brings to the research process, so that he or she can sort of check that at the door and take more of this unbiased perspective, like our quantitative friends, like our quantitative friends. There's another kind sort of qualitative researcher who would say the person of the researcher matters and should be engaged in the research process, should directly influence the research process. These are more liberal researchers. We'll look at their kind of work and have some very lively discussion about it, because many people would say, well, that's not necessarily research. So that will be coming toward the end of the class. Data collection usually occurs in naturalistic settings, because we're trying to get an idea of what it's like to be in a person's shoes. We will go and collect data in those settings where that person lives and breathes and does his or her business. Transparency in data collection and analysis is important. So one thing about qualitative data is that it's big. Text is big. And so being transparent in terms of how those big kind of data were reduced, to a form where, now we have these results that are pretty succinct that are being presented. That transparency needs to be there so you can see how you got from this big amount into sort of the synthesis you see in an article. So that ends our tutorial. I encourage you again to go back to your qualitative article now and see if you can sort of see how these points that I just talked about are mapping onto that particular article. And like I said at the beginning, we're going to be looking at these articles to make sure that everybody has a general layout of the land in terms of how they're laid out and organized, and kind of what they're attempting to do in their research. So the more time you put into figuring that out before class, the faster we can go. So this ends the tutorial, and I will see you on Thursday.